Generally, yes, but man, you're difficult today. Man, you're difficult today. It's a lot. Um,
That's just on the first pot of coffee, man. Wait till pot three.
dude, I'm so glad I gave up coffee. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'd be telling jokes like you do. I'm just doing the black tea thing. The nice Earl Grey. It's been wonderful. It's a lot less puns, thank God. Thank
Yeah,
thank God.
that's the problem. All the caffeine represses the glands in my brain that would otherwise make me at least try to supplant the jokes, right? So I end up sublimating all the puns anyways, but more directly.
Oh, oh, Jack, Jack. Oh my God, every layer with you. Everything's a layer of layers.
I know we're in the depths.
Derek, I love Earl Grey. Why do communists like Earl Grey? I'll tell you. It's because of Jean-Luc Picard for me. I can't help it. I don't know why. I like Earl Grey in general, but there's something about just in my brain, it tickles that space. I'm a Star Trek guy. It's a sad nerd thing. It's not property. Oh my God. I can hear that in your accent as you type it. All right. Fuck it. We'll kick off. We'll get going here. Uh, this is going to be a fun day. There's a lot. There's a lot today. So thank those of you who've been able to join us, and thank those of you who are listening. We are moving into a lovely, lovely Monday with the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we move into the 32nd series on the different kinds of series. This is going to be a fun one. We're going to be continuing to do what we did last week, which is a closer read. There is a very good chance this is going to end up being 2 weeks. There is even a chance we may end up extending into a third week so we can have a full discussion on this depending on where we end up turning out. No major announcements or anything big today, although I will say that if you like what we're doing, you can follow us on Twitter for my one tweet a week, or you can also support us on Patreon. Every dollar helps. We're heading towards doing our Divagations conference. We're trying to build out an entire conception around the idea of thought that wanders and what that means. And we don't actually know. That's kind of the fun part of it. So if you'd like to contribute, we'd love any help we could be of any format, any type, any setup. You can check us out on our Discord server and the Divagations area. I'm going to go ahead and kick off by just simply reading this first paragraph, and we will end up having a much larger discussion about everything. We also have recently, for all of this is fun. We've been starting to do film reviews and discussions. We started our first one. We did a very close watching of Eyes Wide Shut, where we went super down a rabbit hole with that film. And we intend to do it every week. We're going to be doing another one this week. We're debating between The Lighthouse and Enemy. If you have an idea, feel free to hit the movie area. And we will be doing that and having a larger discussion sometime in the next week about it as well. It'll be fun. But for Logic of Sense, I will begin the read. Melanie Klein remarks that between symptoms and sublimations. Let me share the PDF. Melanie Klein remarks that between symptoms and sublimations, there must be an intermediary series corresponding to cases of less successful sublimation. But the whole of sexuality, in its own right, is a less successful sublimation. It is intermediary between the symptoms of corporeal death and the sublimations of the incorporeal surface. And in this intermediary state, it is organized in series on its own intermediary surface. Depth is not organized in series. The fragmentation of its objects and the undifferentiated plentitude of the body that it contrasts to the fragmented objects prevent it from happening in the void. On one hand, it presents blocks of coexistence, bodies without organs or words without articulation. On the other hand, it presents sequences of partial objects bound only by the common property of being detachable and fragmentable, introjectable and projectable, bursting and causing to burst. Thus the renowned sequence breast food excrement penis infant. These two aspects, sequence and block, represent the forms taken on respectively by displacement and condensation in depth with the schizoid position. It is with sexuality, that is to say, with the release of the sexual drives, that the series begins, because the serial form is a surface organization. I made a joke right before we started with Derek that I thought we might spend an hour, at least a half hour on this first paragraph. I still stand by that. Who would like to start with analysis on this one?
Sorry, yeah, I think it's. I think there's a kind of it's a descriptive thing which you can work through. I mean, I think we need to say at the beginning that it's about series, so it's kind of going back to a theme that's already been touched upon. I think what he's talking about here, as he says, the title says the different kinds of series and these series, and so we're going to go through different kinds of series relating to sexuality. So he starts off by referring to Melanie Klein, who remarks that between symptoms and sublimations, there must be an intermediary series corresponding to cases of less successful sublimation. So, I think this is the first time he's used the word symptom, but I might be wrong.
It is. I think it is. I believe the first time as well, which is unique.
But then obviously sublimation is a term he's talked about previously, and we talked about it last week. So again, it's useful to sort of remember what is a sublimation. I've just kind of quote from the previous series: the operation through which the trace of castration becomes a line of thought. So that there is this notion of a kind of thought being engendered through a kind of process of sublimation.
It's my understanding of it is I like that definition because it works. It's kind of the other side of it. Sublimation, my understanding is that drives themselves have a fairly sexual aim, libidinal drives, and at some point we move those libidinal drives to being something that isn't just sex. It diverts it towards art or creation in other formats, basically cultural things. No?
Yeah. So no, I disagree. Yeah.
Okay, making sure. I'm not big on the. I'm not super good on the Freud and Klein stuff. Normally, we'd have Ken in here, and we'd be yelling at him and all of that. But yeah.
I think this is a Deleuzian idea, though. I would say that because I think it's still very much tied to Stoic thought. I would say because he's still talking about surfaces, height, and depth. These are, I think, essentially. I would say Stoic ways of thought.
Well, I'd agree. Well, it's the line that follows that where he says the whole of sexuality in its own right is a less successful sublimation, which is, again, to go back to his series of sexuality and how it's generated and what he says through this paragraph of surfaces and how they operate, that would follow. Which is, again, there's a lot said there instead of the sort of general stance, again, of how I understand a lot of psychoanalysis is that we have our sexual drives, we divert them into other things. But he's saying, no, we have our drives that basically the less successful sublimation becomes sexuality, that the drives sort of yield that rather than being the sort of pure aim of them.
Well, I think what he says, so the whole of sexuality in its own right is a less successful sublimation, then you get a hyphen. No, colon, sorry, I want to talk. Colon, anyway, it doesn't matter. It is,
yeah.
And then he says, then he kind of, he then qualifies this by saying what he means. He said it's the intermediary in the symptoms of corpse. So he's now saying what he means by the word symptom. So it's an intermediary between the symptoms of corporeal depth and the sublimations in corporeal surface. So it's following from what you're saying, Brooke. I think is that it's saying that sexuality is the intermediary that allows this go from the corporeal depths, the symptoms of corporeal depths, and sublimation in corporeal surface. So, which is the kind of metaphysical surface I think we've talked about previously, which is where thought is kind of resides. And it says in this intermediary state. So this is a kind of state, the intermediate between the depth and the thought and the metaphysical surface. In this intermediate state, it is organized in series on its own intermediary surface. So he's given a kind of structure for this. So this is why he's talking about series. He's saying so this kind of sexuality is organized in series on its own intermediate surface. So he's kind of setting up the structure through which happens. There goes on to say depth is not organized in series. He gives a reason for that.
Yeah, because it's at the basic level, the way the depth operates is its own fragmentation and its own undifferentiated plentitude of the body that it contrasts to the fragmented objects prevent series from happening in the void in itself. The very nature of how the void sort of is prevents series from existing, which, again, makes sense and follows what he's been saying up to this point. Then he follows it by saying, on the one hand, it presents blocks of coexistence, which is, to say it another way as I read this, there's still bodies and there's still shit next to each other. It's not like there's not stuff in there, but the blocks of coexistence aren't necessarily series. They are words without articulations. They are bodies without organs. They are these blocks of coexistence of the collections, if you might say, of these fragmented objects within that. That setup itself is, it's an interesting phrasing of it. Am I understanding that right, do you think? Just because it's such an odd phrasing.
I want to ask, is that still part of the sublimation process, where these blocks and words without articulation, is that at the beginning or the part of the sublimation process?
If I could comment there, yeah, I do think as I'm reading it, I think it is part of the sublimation process. And the reason I think that is, so this is going to put it just in the classical psychoanalysis, but I think it'll at least help measure the distance that we're going in this series, right? So if we were to put it in terms of sublimation, that right, and the depth kind of being like since he's calling an undifferentiated plenitude of the body in that, right? That's kind of how the unconscious is talked about in some of the classic psychoanalytic literature, Jung and Freud, for instance. They're concerned with that undifferentiated depth, and these things that haven't necessarily come into consciousness yet. So like what I'm seeing here is that this point about sublimation, which is again in classic psychoanalysis, is sort of like the superego helping the ego figure out how to release the tension in a socially acceptable way for the situation, right? And obviously that's at a distance from where we've come in this book, but if you measure that distance from that model, then yeah, I think that is part of the sublimation process, because what Deleuze seems to be saying then is depth is not organized in series because a process of differentiation has not occurred, right? And this is, I think, why he's kind of talking about this fragmentation of objects and that. I think he's talking about a kind of difference between what's in the depths and then like the partial objects, right? Where you kind of have interjection and I think more questions of cathexis or just general investing coming up.
Well, and that's the phrasing he uses here is unique because we're talking about series of series, and he says, no, depth doesn't have that. But he does say that it presents sequences of partial objects bound only by the common property of being detachable and fragmentable, that it's not series as he's been using it. It's not series in terms of a kind of the general gist of how sense is produced or how we find meaning, but instead there are sequences of partial objects that are bound together. There is a nature of, in the depths, things sort of go together or come together or are together, but it doesn't operate in the same way as series does. Just having a pile of shit together doesn't make it things, I guess, would be a way to, another way he might phrase that.
Right, and to make a closing point for my part, yeah, just like you're saying, right? There's kind of these collections here, um, or these blots, right? Or I guess more so, yeah, that would be the blots, as opposed to the sequences, and that was kind of the thing I latched on to is like words without articulation. Kind of suggests to me that problem of right. It kind of calls to mind this problem of how does language come about, and we have to say it all at once, right? So this is kind of like where I see it. This is kind of that question of like bodies making sounds and all of that, right? But without like without language necessarily being at play here. It's still very corporeal. And then like you're saying, Brits, on the other hand, we're starting to get these partial objects um, in terms of and I believe this is him talking about blocks here, right? So you have like these sequences of noises and corporeal stuff, but you also have, and I think this is where the series is too. You start to have the series of these blocks, right? These partial objects that are starting to come together and be capable of interjection and projection, right? That they can actually be sort of invested in that manner.
I'm sorry to disagree because I just don't. I think if you go back to the first sentence, the Klein remarks that between symptoms and sublimations must be an intermediary series. So this is what's between the symptoms and between the sublimation. I think that's the key phrase I would say at the beginning. So he's actually going to the thing about the kind of idea of sexuality is what occurs at the surface. He talks about its own intermediary surface. So he says that the things of the depth have these blocks and sequences. At the final sentence, he says it is with sexuality that the real sexual drive that the series begins, because the serial form is a surface organization, and that's what he's focusing on. Focus on the serial form of sexuality. So I would say at this point, I mean, it might come back in by what he said at the beginning. He's saying this is what's between the symptom, the bodily sublimation, the kind of thing that's then projected onto the metaphysical surface, the thought. I think that this is the point of this paragraph, to set this up so this is what I think is being said here.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing where we disagree then.
That's what I was going to say. I was like,
wouldn't
that
the-
sounds exactly like, I think that you're saying different words with it for sure, but I think it's
No, I thought the question right that started the discussion was, is this still part of the sublimation process? It was asked by,
Oh,
I
well,
think,
yeah.
JK. I don't think it is. I don't think it's a part of the sublimation process at this point, because I think the sublimation process is that kind of thing that happens beyond, that's sublimated into the kind of metaphysical surface. This is the thing that's between, this is the intermediary between the symptom and the sublimation. So it's not part of the process of sublimation. So I was responding to that question because I thought you agreed with the questioner.
Yeah, so that would be, and then that's directed at me then. So yeah, the reason I'm saying yes there is, and I would ask you for your thoughts then. The sentence you're quoting, right? There must be an intermediary series corresponding to cases of less successful sublimation. So that intermediary series you're talking about corresponds to a less successful sublimation. So it does seem to at least be part of the sublimation process, if not part of a sublimation process all its own. But what do you think there?
Yeah, it could be. You could be right there. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I think. I mean, for me, I think in reading this, I think there is he places this thing in between those two things. I think the focus is on the series that's happening as the intermediate. Like I say, it might come back in then. I think that's a good point you've made. I think it's a good point. I'm not sure whether it's if it's part of that sublimation process. So it might be. It might be.
So he
No,
does have a line that says that depth is not organized in series. So I don't know if if it's not a part of the series, it's not. Does that mean it's not part of the sublimation process?
No,
But
I think he's saying it's like the fount of it. Like, so if we're talking about the generation of things, we have all of the partial objects, we have the depths. Like I'm trying to talk about it like a more topology of it. We have all these little balls floating around that are things in the depths, and they're in groups. There's groups of them. Like if we were to look at them, we can see that there are blocks of coexistence. There is stuff that's together just generally. My hand has all of its molecules in very specific places, but that doesn't mean anything in and of itself. He's saying from there we have this sort of move from just a general a process that as this moves to sexuality, as this moves to other things, as this moves to having meaning, it goes through this sort of, and he puts it in quotes. I don't think he's necessarily even talking about sublimation. I think he's more saying mockingly that we have these two aspects, that the sequence of these elements and the blocks of these bodies that have the forms that take on, respectively, by displacement and condensation and depth within the schizoid position. Sexuality through here, as he's described it before, is that sort of step that begins where we have the erogenous zones, where we place that intermediary sort of middle surface that the series is allowed to even exist at that point. So it's his sort of joke is that it's not about this sort of less successful sublimation, but that everything necessitates this less successful sublimation. Because ultimately, the serial form is a surface organization, not within the bodies. Maybe I'm over-explaining it.
So the surface form is the sublimation that emerges out of the depths, right? But the depths are not yet a series, that represents the sublimation.
I think my kind of objection to this kind of thinking a little bit is because I think there's an overemphasis on the idea of sublimation, which ties us very much. It seems very much to psychology, whereas I think he's definitely returning to that kind of stoic structure. This is why he refers to series. And when he was first brought up the series earlier on, it was very much to do. Well, it's to do with language as well. The way language, way sense is the way sense is created, and the kind of way things work together with each other. And as far as I've read through this chapter, but does he actually return to sublimation in this series, to this opening paragraph?
yeah, if I could play off that, I do think you make a good point that we and
Sure.
like Brooks said, right, it's a less successful sublimation with less successful in quotes, right? So
I
he
think
is
he's
kind
being
of
snarky in that Deleuze French way that he does in a lot of his books, where it's like, it's a less successful sublimation. Like there's that edge to it, I think, personally.
yeah, yeah, I get the sense of an edge too, but yet he doesn't put sublimation in quotes, which is interesting. So I think Derek, where I think I'm crossing over, or our thoughts crossing over them, and Brooks, I think you're probably here with us, is that if we want to step back from the sublimation for a minute, like you're saying, it's the intermediary, which would seem to be the release of sexual drives, right? And that's where you're getting, I think, the creation of the two, of the series of the, or excuse me, of the blocks and the, here we go, sequence and plots. I've got AO on my mind. I want to see flows and break flows. That's where you're getting the sequences and the blots, right? Is through the release of sexual drives, which is called a sublimation, but at the same time, it's like you're saying, it's not exactly a sublimation, is it?
Yeah, maybe what connects what we're talking about, the depth and the beginning of sublimation is maybe the phantasm. That's the role that it plays, perhaps that connects the two you know uh, areas that we're talking about, the surface
I
and
think if you just go back over this paragraph, he says that it starts with that remark that between symptoms and sublimation there must be an intermediate series. I think that's a kind of key point, because this is what he's going to talk about in this series is series. So he talks about a 30-second series on the different kinds of series. So previously, if we remember, we have heterogeneous and homogeneous series. Those are the two kinds of series that we previously spoke about. So I think within this, I think if I remember, I think there's a third kind that appears in this, but I might be wrong on that. Anyway, so he's talking about the different kinds of series. And sorry, so he marks between symptoms and sublimation, that's the intermediary series. One suspects that this intermediate series will be the vehicle through which he will now talk about different kinds of series. So he says correspond to less successful sublimation. Anyway, just going a little bit forward to this notion of depth. I think he's looking depth. I think the reason I feel depth is introduced because it's like something that doesn't engage in series at all. So it's looking at how it works with the elements of depth in terms of fragmentation, etc. And this notion, so it presents blocks of coexistence and sequences of partial objects. Now, I think looking ahead a little bit, we get a similar kind of processes within this the series of sexuality. You get this notion of the coexistence kind of appearing. Also, you get this notion of sequence, which is, as you've said, Brooks, is to do with series. One might think a sequence. In some way, the kind of homogeneous series be thought as a sequence.
Yes. No, I would say if I had to go back, that's 100% what I'd say, that we're talking here about the homogeneous series, which can't be a series like in the early parts. It's necessarily heterogeneous. Am I right on that? To remember that, I need to go back.
I think it is in the examples you give. It starts off by looking like it is homogeneous because each part follows on from the other, but then each element within it has a different function, and that's how we can it then has a kind of heterogeneity attached to it. But like I say, I think that's the depth, but the depth is not going to be the focus, I would say, at all. I mean, again, I've read this a couple of times, and it is extremely difficult to hold the whole thing in your head. So I'm always really happy to be proved wrong by the actual reading. In my impression of this series, that it's very much focused on describing the series that in relation to sexuality. In the first, I would split this series into two, actually. The first half, he talks about, I think, the three types of series, three kinds of series that he wants to talk about. Then the second part of the series, I think he then relates it to language.
There's a third.
I might.
Yeah.
There's a third. Yeah, there are three. Yeah, I mean, yeah. That's why I think the notion of depth is it's a bit of a red herring to follow that line of thinking, because it's like sublimation and depth. I think this is very much, it's about series, it's about the surface. It's its essential nature, I would say.
We're about to get into that, because the three types of series that he's talking about, there's no way I'm not going to be able to distinguish this from AO and bring in discussions from that. There's no way I'm going to be able to avoid doing that, so I apologize in advance. I mean, we're talking here throughout this about his take on Oedipus, on his take on sexuality, his take on how we utilize Oedipus and the mommy, daddy, me sort of triangle in all of this, and how the series itself is generated, the types of series within this. Again, the way that the surface operates, and the hero of the surface, the Hercules or the Oedipus, who walks the surface after conquering the depths and fighting on high and is able to do that. The line here that ends it, and it's the big one, it's the last sentence, is, "It is with sexuality, the release of the sexual drives, that the series begins, because the serial form is a surface organization." That interstitial series, or that interstitial surface of sexuality that comes in here, this process, as he's describing it, is to him necessary. We've just talked through the erogenous zones, the entire series of sexuality, as he dives through and explains how erogenous zones operate, how drives get separated from on high, 6,000 feet on high, as he says, to sort of pull from Zarathustra. This push is driving us towards this thing where it's like, hey, here is how actually this happens now and how these surfaces get made, but also how there are interstitial surfaces. And there's different types of series within it that sort of drive different levels. And that's, I think, to your point, Derek, that's what we're aiming at here. And that's why I keep going back to the two aspects, sequence and block. With sequence being the partial objects bound only by the common property of being detachable and fragmentable. And then the blocks of coexistence, bodies without organs or words without articulation, are the two elements we're talking about here. These two things are the forms taken on by displacement and condensation in depth within the schizoid position. And this is the drive where we start with the things as is, and we move through a few layers in order to get to what we have discussed so far being that surface, or where Oedipus lives, all of his good intent. I told you we'd spend forever on this one. I knew it was going to be a half hour on just the first paragraph, and I don't think we've even, like, we've got to continue, because I think we won't necessarily find a place where we stop. Like, I don't think we're disagreeing, I guess would be how I'd put it, if that makes sense. I think we're agreeing and with nuance. Like, there's a lot of slight separations in what we're talking about that we have to continue on in order to find. Just my opinion. But I'm open. If someone else wants to respond, please, because there's a lot here.
I agree. I think, I agree with that. Yeah, totally.
So when he ends the last, with this line that says that the series is a surface organization, right? Series form is a surface. It means that that is the sublimation process and he's that's distinguished from the depths of bodies and bodies without organs and words without articulation, right? So there is a distinction he's making between what he means by sublimation, which is a kind of a surface serial organization, and the depths, right?
Which is what he calls the symptoms of corporeal depth.
Okay.
But the phrasing is we have between symptoms and sublimations. Between this corporeal depth and that incorporeal surface, there has to be intermediary series.
Right. So they could be part of the sublimation process, but what he means by sublimation is a surface organization, not the depths.
I think so, yes.
I think you kind of got to go back to what we were saying earlier. We've almost got to partition out like sublimation, the less successful sublimation, which is the release of sexual drives, right? So instead of dealing with sublimation at like the more finer point of the superego's involvement, Deleuze seems to be kind of backing up and saying, right, there's just the release of sexual drives here, which we can call a less successful sublimation, but if we take it on its own terms, it's kind of doing something different, right? Which is the creation of this incorporeal intermediary.
And if we go back to the series of sexuality, we're talking about things that ultimately it's about bodies. Erogenous zones are themselves inseparable from partial objects, and the way that they connect with other zones, as he says. And he talks through this and the dynamic genesis of it when the surfaces form, the superego from on high separating things out, playing with drives, all of this, the process of sexuality coming to be or becoming a thing is, I think, what he's getting at here. That there is, it's not just, we have sexual drives and then sublimation. He's saying, I think, that at the base level, we have all of this crazy shit the bodies are doing, and there's groups of them, there's maybe a sequence of them, whatever it may be, that we can maybe is sort of recognizable in a way, but as we go through the process, sexuality and the erogenous zones and all this stuff that's mixed in are kind of generated, and that there's a series, and then at that point, actually, this is where the series really begins, after sexuality has sort of been released. And this process from the depths to the surface, there's that intermediary series he's referring to here, that surface, the interstitial surface, intermediary surface of this sort of, that step of the sexuality that's between, I think. Again, there's a lot said here. And I'm even evolving what I'm saying as I'm saying it, because now, listening to you guys, I've got to rethink some things.
Yeah, likewise.
Could I get a brief definition of sublimations?
Yeah, so
Just quickly.
sublimation
I'm sorry.
is the psychoanalytic process of a pure sexual drive, a libidinal energy, which generally is thought, or originally was thought with Klein especially, to be a push towards sexuality, a child wanting gratification, playing with his dick, whatever. There's this natural sexual energy. A healthy person sublimates this. We transfer that energy into better uses. I, for example, run a reading group for Logic of Sense. That's how I've sublimated my perverse sexual energies. That's sublimation, is the process of turning this sexual energy into what you might call useful energy. And I think that there's a normative take to that for sure. It's very complicated, but that's like my short version. Is that a Derek, Jack, basically?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the classic psychoanalytic take, right? We're just kind of trying to keep it a little simple there.
Yeah.
Deleuze has his own, right? He's creating a distance from that.
Oh yeah, no, he's charging the other. He's charging in a very different direction.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find the definition, but just to give you an instance, right? Because we're going to be going over from like sexuality to thought. This is page 219. But what does it mean to recover and to integrate? We gave the name sublimation, in quotes, to the operation through which the trace of castration becomes the line of thought, and thus to the operation through which the sexual surface and the rest are projected to the surface of thought. So the big thing there is like he is reworking the idea of sexuality and sublimation. I think one of the things that kind of helps me here is if you put this all the way back to the inversion of Platonism, right? One thing that sticks out to me here is it's almost like I almost think about the forms as kind of underlying everything and keeping everything in check as it changes. And here Deleuze is almost like, right there, just kind of your inversion. It's almost like he's saying, no, instead of forms, you have sexual drives that are basically behind all of these changes, right? Through the intermediariness that it provides the connection of, right, between the blocks and the God, I keep wanting to say flow sequences.
But I'd even take it one step further, because for him, one of the things classically with sublimation is that it necessitates castration. Like that's kind of an underlying requirement of general sublimation. This assumption that you have to have this repression, you have to have sort of castration properly instanced, and there's ways that it's overdone or less, blah blah blah, Lacan, etc. And I think he's taking also here a different direction of how to think about that, or how it's not so much exactly that castration does this, and he's going to be talking through how sexuality is generated, and then from there how actually we sort of shift the drives into better uses, and how sublimation, as he jokingly calls it, I think, is happening. But the next paragraph, I think, begins that. I'm going to read through the first series. Now, he's got 3 series. The next paragraph is kind of 2 of them very quickly, and then the next paragraph after that is the third. So I'm going to read up until we get to the second series of the 3. This is a nightmare. We must therefore distinguish, in the different moments of sexuality previously considered, very different kinds of series. There are, first, the erogenous zones of pre-genital sexuality. Each one of them is organized in a series which converges around a singularity represented most often by an orifice surrounded by a mucous membrane. The serial form is founded in the erogenous zone of the surface, insofar as the latter is defined by the extension of a singularity, or what amounts to the same thing, by the distribution of a difference of potential or intensity, having a maximum and a minimum. The series ends around points which depend upon another series. The serial form on the erogenous zones, therefore, is founded on a mathematics of singular points and on a physics of intensive quantities. But it is in yet another manner that each erogenous zone supports a series, this time a series of images projected over the zone. Series of images projected over the zone, that is, a series of objects capable of assuring for the zone an autoerotic satisfaction. I believe that's actually where we move into the second. Am I right there?
I think the second comes
A little further.
later, doesn't it? Oh no, perhaps you're right. But second, it is clear. All right, perhaps it does. I just read literally where it says, but quite later on, but second is clear the problem. Perhaps, yeah, you might be right, yeah.
Because it says this. Let's
Maybe
I think
do the
it's given
example.
examples. It's given
Yeah.
examples.
please, Derek.
Do the example and then go.
Yeah.
It's just giving. He's now giving examples.
I think so.
Because I think where he says, but second, it's clear that the problem of the phallic coordination comes. I read that as being the second, but I obviously didn't read it that closely enough. I mean, I think where he says second, he means second, but I think this, where he continues, he gives example, sucking of images, sucking object sucking images or zone, and then he kind of expands out on that.
Well, so the first series, as he's described here, he's described before. The erogenous zones of pre-genital sexuality, each of them organized in a series which converges around a singularity represented most often by an orifice surrounded by a mucous membrane, which is a hilarious way to describe all of our different places. And I think he's doing that intentionally, again, talking about what they are rather than adding the natural sexual element. There's a coldness to it that he's intentionally playing. To him, as he says here, the serial form is founded in the erogenous zone of the surface, insofar as the erogenous zone of the surface is defined by the extension of a singularity, or, what amounts to the same thing, by the distribution of a difference of potential or intensity, having a maximum and a minimum. This series around points which depend upon another series. This is the important part here, I think, as he's talking about it. The nature of this sort of serial form that exists, the erogenous zones themselves of pre-genital sexuality naturally exists only within these other series, but they themselves are a series that these things are layered into. That's why I think the second thing here is talking about is the second. The serial form on the erogenous zones, therefore, is founded on a mathematics of singular points and a physics of intensive qualities. But it's in another manner, I'll continue reading, that each erogenous zone supports a series. This time, a series of images is projected over the zone, that is, a series of objects capable of assuring for the zone an autoerotic satisfaction. Consider, for example, objects of sucking or images of the oral zone. Each one becomes coextensive to the entire range of the partial surface and traverses it as it explores its orifice and fields of intensity, from the maximum to the minimum and vice versa. They are organized into series according to the way in which they are made coextensive. A piece of candy, for example, or chewing gum, the surface of which is multiplied by its being crunched, by being stretched, respectively. But they are also organized according to their origin, that is, according to the whole from which they are extracted. I wonder if that is meant to be just a great second pun there. Another region of the body, another person, external object or reproduction of an object, a plaything, etc., and according to the degree of their distance from the primitive objects of alimentary and destructive drives from which the sexual drives were just released. In each of these senses, a series linked to an erogenous zone appears to have a simple form, to be homogeneous, to give rise to a synthesis of succession, which may be contracted as such, and which in any case constitutes a simple connection.
Yeah, just to
Yep.
that's what I think is the first series. So it's given multiple examples in a way, but I think that's his first form, and it is that homogeneous form. That's why I thought that was the first one.
Oh, I think you're right. Yep, I think you're right. We'll stop there. So that is the first one. You're right. It's him giving a series. It's difficult because we're talking, the way he's phrasing it almost topologically is not so much that it's its own surface, it's that it's a series within a surface that connects to the next surface. So it's not quite as crisp as three separate surfaces that sort of have things move within each other. There's parts to it.
I think the key is that it says that serial form is a surface organization. That's what he says right at the end of the previous paragraph. It says we must, in this paragraph you just read, the different moments of sexuality, we must therefore distinguish different moments of sexuality previously considered the very different kinds of series. And then he talks about the erogenous zones. I think these are series connected to the erogenous zones of pre-genital sexuality. Each one of them is organized in a series, called conveys around singularity. So there is this relationship between a series and a singularity. So the singularity is the place where something happens, where a change takes place. So the erogenous zones are organized by singularity, which is represented most often by an orifice surrounded by a mucous membrane. So this is a point of change. And he goes on to say the serial form is founded in the erogenous zones of surface, insofar as the latter is defined by the extension of singularity, or by almost the same thing, by distribution differential. Anyway, so, we could go on and perhaps look at this in great detail, I suppose, but.
Well, and it's because it's this last part I just want to reread before we go into the final bit of this paragraph, because it's this last thing. In each of these senses, a series linked to an erogenous zone appears to have a simple form, to be homogeneous, to give rise to a synthesis of succession, which may be contracted as such, and which in any case constitutes a simple connection. But second, it is clear that the problem of the phallic coordination of the erogenous zones comes to complicate the serial form. Without doubt, the series prolong one another and converge around the phallus as the image imposed on the genital zone. The genital zone has its own series. It is inseparable, however, from a complex form which subsumes under it heterogeneous series, now that a condition of continuity or convergence has replaced homogeneity. It gives rise to a synthesis of coexistence and coordination and constitutes a conjunction of the subsumed series. Oh, God.
Well, I think if we just go through this, so he's talking about the general structure of the series in relation. So he says erogenous zones, which are organized in a series around this singularity, which he says is the orifice surrounded by a mucous membrane. So it's defined by the extension of a singularity, right? So just carry on there. I think he's talking here about the kind of general structure of a series in which that they kind of one meets the other, and there is that. This is how the things kind of join onto each other. The serial form on the erogenous zone is founded on a mathematics of singular points. So I'm not quite sure anything that means by that, and on the physics of intensive quantities. But then the key then is yet another manner that each erogenous zone supports a series, and this is time of series images are projected over the zone. It's this kind of notion in which images are projected over the zone. That is a series of objects capable of showing for the zone an autoerotic satisfaction. So this is where he brings in this notion of the coextensive, the way in which things get extended by either being crunched or being or chewing gum that's being stretched. This idea is previously touched upon quite a few series ago, but it's not a new idea, but it's now obviously being said in a different place, I would say.
Well, and he also he has this
sorry,
this line in here. I'm curious your thoughts on, because it's one of the things I'm getting stuck on is in each of these senses, a series linked to an erogenous zone appears to have a simple form, to be homogeneous, to give rise to a synthesis of succession. The word appears very specifically there is odd to me, because he doesn't do anything to sort of dissuade that. He instead later actually says that it has homogeneity, or that, as he says, from a complex form which subsumes under it heterogeneous series, now that a condition of continuity or convergence has replaced homogeneity. Is there a reason here that he uses that phrasing? Appears to be simple, to be homogeneous. Appears implies that it's not. That it's an illusion.
The way I'd read that is because it's disrupted the second series, because it's a homogeneous series, so one thing leads to another, what leads to another leads to another, and each element of the series, a homogeneous series, is, I think, characterized by the fact that each element in the series is the same as the previous one. And it's only when you actually look at the kind of way in which they interact that suddenly it becomes heterogeneous. That's previously what he said. He says, I think it's my feeling is that if we just look at the in terms of the erogenous zones, their organization to zones, then we project images are projected onto them, what he calls so the zone becomes zones of autoerotic satisfaction, etc. But then the problem with the phallic coordination, so this is what coordinates from the outside, so this notion of the phallic coordination, because it's at the surface, so this is where the phallic intervenes, is at the surface. So the problem with the phallic coordinated erogenous zones comes to complicate the serial form. So the homogeneous series is a very kind of just happens, one thing happens after the other. There's no complication in it. When the kind of phallic intervenes, it becomes complicated, and it's imposed on what he calls the genital zone, so it becomes different to the erogenous zone.
Right, which is the genital zone is sort of, if we want to say, the next step. But it's, again, to go back, so he's got this line, it is inseparable from a complex form which subsumes under it heterogeneous series. Now a condition has replaced homogeneity. Homogeneous series are themselves made up of two heterogeneous series of one type, but different from the other, the signifying versus the signified. And this is sort of that early part of the series on serialization where he kind of goes through this. So the sort of setup as he's sort of charging through this, to me, this reads as if he's talking about, we have the heterogeneous series, we have at its base level, this thing that appears to be homogeneous. The erogenous zone appears to be simple. But actually what we're talking about is the generation of continuity, where the phallus comes out and puts an image over on the genital zone, the steps of sexuality, and suddenly the genital zone now has its own series. The view of homogeneity, the appearance of homogeneity, normally takes this over. It appears to have that. But his argument, I think, here is that we're talking now about specifically continuity or convergence that replaces it in this case, giving rise to a synthesis of coexistence and coordination, and constitutes a conjunction with the subsumed series, which are the erogenous and genital.
Because I think if we go back, so he says earlier on, he said in each of these senses, a series linked to erogenous zones appears to have a simple form, which is your, where you were talking about earlier, appear to have a simple form. So the simple form is to be homogeneous. This is what they appear to have, this simple form of homogeneity. And what does that entail? It says to give rise to a synthesis of succession. One thing, this is the kind of characteristic of the homogeneity. homogeneous series is that one thing follows another. So there's a synthesis of succession, which may be contracted as such, I'm not sure what that means, and which in any case constitutes a simple connection. So there is a connection between these, but it's a simple one. One thing just follows from another. So the example he gives in terms of denotation, the name of something is endless. Each one is the same as the other. So that's a kind of homogeneous series. But if you look at it in more detail, you'll see that actually the name of something is different from the thing it names. But anyway, that's going back. He says this clear that the problem with the phallic coordination of erogenous zones comes to complement the series. This is what complicates it. It takes it away from this homogeneous form. So the series prolong, one of them converge around the phallus, right? The genital zone in its own series is separate from a complex form. So we have a simple form, now we have a complex form, which subsumes under it heterogeneous series. So it's a kind of complex form which has under it this heterogeneous form of heterogeneity. And so before the homogeneous was characterized by a synthesis of succession, now that it's a condition of continuity or conversion has replaced homogeneity. It's a synthesis of coexistence and coordination. This is different from this notion of succession and constitutes a conjunction of the subsumed series. And I think this notion of conjunction is how things obviously join. I mean, we have this thing of the disjunctive, anyway, synthesis, things like that. I mean, he's bringing these terms in from earlier series.
Yes. Well, and so are we talking here then, just to go through the steps, we're talking about first we have the erogenous / genital, but ultimately that's covered up by the phallic coordination of the surface, the second series, which is the phallic. And then obviously the third would be edipalization, sort of within itself. These are the three layers. The sexuality previously considered, very different types of series. The specifics within this seems to, I think we're gonna keep repeating ourselves because this is just a nightmare.
I think the structure is, I feel, not that complex, because I think he's saying the first one is a homogeneous one, whereby images are projected onto things. So we project, for example, autoerotic satisfaction onto a piece of candy that we might be chewing, and or a piece of gum, so a piece of candy, but crunching a piece of gum. So we, in that way in which that thing, so he says in a way they're made coextensive.
Yes. So
So
sucking on a lollipop.
One.
Sucking on a lollipop or biting a lollipop, whatever it may be, there's something there that's definitely coextensive in that way.
So it's a simple kind of relationship between that activity and that kind of autoerotic, that kind of projection of the image of autoerotic satisfaction projected onto that. But then we get the second stage, which is the phallic, which is this thing that comes from outside. I mean, I would say that the autoerotic is in maybe to do with the pre-genital, what he's previously called the pre-genital stage. I don't want to tie myself to that, but just maybe that. This thing is when the phallic, the thing, this kind of like this organizing principle that comes from outside, that is after the pre-genital stage. It's when it's a thing that wants to retrieve wants to mend the mother, retrieve the father, bring them together, all that kind of stuff. This is the phallic stage, I would say. This is when is what complicates this sense of homogeneity which things have. So in this early stage, the homogeneous stage, there's a simple relationship between things we put in our mouth and our feeling of happiness, etc., etc. Then the phallic stage, sort of the second one, it's complicated by the phallic coordinate, as he said, the phallic coordination of erogenous zones complicates the serial form.
Hmm. And then we have the third, which I think it's time to move towards. And I'm just going to run through this whole thing because I think there's nowhere to stop here. Third, We know that the phallic coordination of surfaces is necessarily accompanied by Oedipal affairs, which in turn emphasize parental images. In the development proper to Oedipus, therefore, these images enter into one or several series, a heterogeneous series with alternating terms, father and mother, or two coexisting series, maternal and paternal. For example, wounded, restored, castrated, castrating mother, withdrawn, evoked, killed, and killing father. Moreover, this or these Oedipal series enter into relation with the pre-genital series, with the images which corresponded to them, and even with the groups and persons wherefrom these images were extracted. It is even in this relation between images of different origin, Oedipal and pre-genital, that the conditions of a choice of external object are elaborated. The importance of this new moment or relation could not be too greatly stressed, since it animates the Freudian theory of the event, or rather, of the two series of events. This theory consists first in showing that a traumatism presupposes the existence of at least two independent events, separated in time, one of them infantile, the other post-pubescent, between a sort of resonance is produced. Under a different aspect, the two events are presented as two series, one pre-genital and the other Oedipal, with their resonance being the process of phantasm. In our terminology, it is therefore not a question of events, properly speaking, but rather of two series of independent images, whereby the event is disengaged only through resonance of the series in the phantasm. The first series does not imply a comprehension of the event in question, because it is constructed according to the law of partial pre-genital zones, and because only the phantasm, to the extent that it makes both series resonate, attains such a comprehension. The event to be comprehended is no different from the resonance itself. In this capacity, it is not confused with either of the two series. In any case, it is the resonance of the two independent and temporarily disjointed series that is essential.
I personally feel that paragraph's kind of straightforward.
It actually is. The last one was not, but at all.
Yeah.
So I'll give a top line, and then Derek, I'd love a critique or maybe where you agree or disagree. To just top line say it, for Freud talked about how we have these two moments in time where we have these things that sort of set us up psychologically. We have this moment, that moment, these things, the moments, the events that happen. Deleuze is arguing instead here that actually through these large series of events and the series of images we have generated alongside, let's talk about our entire prepubescent time or our infant time or whatever it may be, these two independent series of images, and through them, in between them, where these things sort of come together, you might say, is actually where we find this, how they fit in within the sort of larger structure we've created amongst these elements is where we're able to find if they connect with the phantasm. There's a deep discussion here about, now I've lost my own train of thought. That's terrible. Please, Derek, Jack, anyone. God damn.
Things play together, kind of.
Say again?
I think, well, for instance, like for me, I oftentimes it's a lot easier to sublimate, for instance, if you do kind of project that sexual, that sexual libidinal energy into like, it's been proven if you have like a piece of hard candy or something, that it's much easier to focus, and so that is a sublimation of the sexual energies, and so you kind of can project things that maybe were objects of desire, in the pre-genital sexual zones, like the mouth, to like onto a piece of candy, say, and then which might well lend itself to your capacity to speak publicly or whatever. I mean, it all works. It's like just a statement of how it all works together. I mean, and I think it also is like an indication if you just like put your sights forward, and like just like full steam ahead, that you kind of like have, there's like a way that things just kind of sync up, because of the way that, we've evolved, I think. Just having set your mind on one matter altogether. Like, for honestly, for me, if I'm sucking on a lollipop, if I'm sitting here thinking about how fucking good that lollipop is, I actually find that it's way better for me to feel creative energy coming off of that high of the sugar rush and the taste of the lollipop. I feel like that's I mean, I have personally experienced uh the epiphany of a lollipop to like social connection and social coordination with people. you know
And I'm just thinking of beginning of this third idea, because I think it does, as you were saying, Nimad, I think it does continue some of the thoughts in that previous paragraph. And I think he extends that. He says, we know the phallic coordination service is accompanied by Oedipal affairs, which emphasize parental images. So he names series. He then names a number of series, heterogeneous series, with what he calls alternating terms, father and mother, or two coexisting series, maternal and paternal. For example, wounded, restored, castrated, and castrating mother, which relates to the maternal. Withdrawn, evoked, killed, and killing father, which relates to the paternal. So all these are kind of areas we've covered previously. So he says there's a relationship between this. So I think originally I thought that the first series was Pre-Genital, I think is confirmed by what he says now. So this Oedipal series interrelation to the Pre-Genital series. This is the point where he talks about this kind of notion of traumatism, the Freudian traumatism. So this relationship between the Pre-Genital and the Oedipal is kind of what this notion of traumatism, the Freudian notion of traumatism is discussed in terms of. But he talks about, and the condition of, he talks about a choice of an external object. So what is this external object? Because if you remember back to the series, there's always an external object that kind of revolves around them. He says, so he then talks about this. It animates the Freudian theory of the event, or rather the two series event. So then he says what this theory is consists first in showing that a traumatism is both the existence of at least independent events separating time, one infantile, the other post-pubescent. So we could say perhaps that the infantile one relates to pre-genital, and the post-pubescent relates to the Oedipal, between which a sort of resonance is produced. Now, so these two series kind of up against each other. As I said, with a series, this series meeting, there's always a need for this object, which kind of circulates. And I think this is what he says is the role of the phantasm.
It's almost as if you have on the one side you have the series of the pre-genital, on the other side you have the Oedipal, and you're almost holding them up, and there's like an electricity or static as you consider both of them, that resonance generates the phantasm, that the phantasm comes about because we're comparing the two, essentially. That we're again, the phantasm being this pure event, this noematic attribute that gets placed to things. It doesn't. It's not necessarily birthed of any specific series, but instead the empty space between them that we're filling naturally by comparing them.
I think it'd be interesting to think what the phantasm it works. So let me just see, because he says anyway, top of the two series of resonating.
Yep.
Because what I would think is that what we've said previously about the phantasm is that it's spoken. it's in a form of speech. So the one that one that those quotes is a child is being beaten. But then we had one, I kind of made the claim that it was a phantasm, which Proust utters, and he said, "Shall I marry Albertine?" These are spoken. I think what happens, my feeling is that you have the Pre-Genital series, you have the Oedipal series, kind of, that the phantasm is what kind of ties them together in when something is expressed as an expression, which is this is my feeling about this, about what the phantasm, this is what it does, it connects the two together. So the event to be, anyway, the first is not imply
just to mention the footnote there, because I think it's just to read a little bit of that footnote. It is essential that the first or pregenital stage, the observation of coitus as the age of 1.5 in the case of the Wolfman, for example, should not be understood as such. As Laplanche and Pontalis say, the first stage and corresponding pregenital images are fragmented, quote, in the series of moments of the transition to autoeroticism. So the perception the Wolfman had, one of the many cases that, famous cases, saw his parents fucking at 1.5. He saw his parents having sex, therefore, and it's like, no, wait, we should actually go back. That this pregenital is actually these fragmented images, these fragmented elements, and what he's going through here as we talk through the series is the two sort of series that are naturally generated unto their own meaning. Because he's been talking about the three elements here. We have the pre-genital, pre-erogenous. We have as a first series, which is fragmented. It's the bodies, as he was saying, followed by kind of these next couple steps that generates these two series, and between them we have the phantasm, which is how we sort of again generate that meaning between them, the pure event. It's an interesting footnote I thought worth mentioning.
Yeah. He says the first series doesn't imply a comprehension of the event in question. So the kind of pregenital one, I would say, comes to lower partial pregenital zones. So phantasm, to the extent it makes both series resonate, attains such a comprehension. So I think I come back to what I said. I still feel it's the expression of the phantasm that causes these two series to resonate, to kind of come up against each other. He says, and the final sentence indicates is the resonance of two independent and temporally disjointed series that is essential. So,
no, you're spot on. I think it's the line, the first series, which is the pregenital, which we just discussed, his example of the Wolfman seeing his parents, but it's fragmented as a series. He says, the first series does not imply a comprehension of the event in question, because it's constructed according to the law of partial pregenital zones, and because only the phantasm, to the extent that it makes both series resonate, attains such a comprehension. Only the phantasm is actually able to apply and create meaning, almost as a quasi-cause, for that first series.
And he says resonance of two independent, so resonance of two independent, temporally disjointed series. Again, this word disjointed, I think, is quite important because it's about them not being, but they're joined together, but they're not disjointed in their connection, which is again a theme that's constantly appears throughout the logic of sense. And again, it comes back to the Stoics and the way in which they looked at disjunction, two things that are not that the disjunction of two propositions, for example, how they function together in their disjunction. So I think again, it's applying that linguistic idea to this construction of the relationship between the two series.
That's the line also here. The event to be comprehended is no different from the resonance itself. Is a hell of a line, because it's again implying very heavily that there is no single event in either series necessarily that we're sort of looking back on, that this Oedipalization or this conjunction, but instead actually the resonance itself is the event that we are now taking part in, again, almost as a quasi-cause for a comprehension of either series. And it's the series, because the series themselves, as you said, are disjointed. They're independent and temporally disjointed, which is, as he's describing it, he's talking about sort of the moment of puberty to the sort of pre-child, pre-genital stages, the very, very early memories of a child, this disjointed mess of things. And where those two sort of coexist is where the phantasm exists. And the phantasm is where the ego sits. So there's a really interesting talk about these two independent, completely separate, disjointed series that is essential to having this phantasm be generated from the resonance between them.
And he says this is, as just looking ahead to the beginning of the next paragraph, here we find ourselves for a third figure of the serial form.
Here we go. Let's do it. Here we find ourselves before a third figure of the serial form. Damn it, I repeated Derek. For the series now under consideration are indeed heterogeneous, but they no longer respond at all to the conditions of continuity and convergence which had ensured their conjunction. On the one hand, they diverge and resonate only in this on this condition. On the other, they constitute ramified disjunctions and give rise to a disjunctive synthesis. The reason for this must be sought at the extremities of the serial form. The fact is that the serial form puts images into play, but whatever the heterogeneity of images might be, whether pre-genital images of partial zones or parental images of Oedipus, we have seen that their common origin is in the idol, or in the good object lost and withdrawn in the heights. It is this object, first of all, that renders possible a conversion of depth into partial surfaces, and a release of these surfaces and of the images haunting them. But it is also the same object which, in the guise of the good penis, projects the phallus as an image over the genital zone. And finally, it is the same object which provides the subject matter, or the quality of parental Oedipal images. One could therefore say, at least, that the series under consideration converge toward the good object of the heights. This, however, is not at all the case. The good object, the idol, functions only insofar as it is lost and withdrawn into this height which constitutes its proper dimension. And, in this capacity, it always acts only as the source of disjunctions, the source of the emission or liberation of alternatives, as it has carried off in its retirement the secret of an immanent, superior unity. It was defined earlier in this manner: wounded unharmed, present absent. Ever since the manic-depressive position, it is in the same vein that it imposes an alternative on the ego to model itself after the good object, or identify itself with bad objects. Moreover, when it renders possible the spreading out of partial zones, it establishes them only as disjointed and separate, to the point that they will find their convergence only with the phallus. And when it determines parental images, it is again by dissociating its own aspects, by distributing them in alternatives, which supply the alternating terms of the Oedipal series, and by arranging them around the image of the mother, wounded and to be healed, and the image of the father, withdrawn and to be made present. Only the phallus would then be left as an agent of convergence and coordination. The problem is that it itself gets involved in Oedipal dissociations. We can clearly see above all that it evades its role if we refer to the other end of the chain, no longer to the origin of images, but rather to their common dissipation during the evolution of Oedipus. Oh, so much said. There's a sentence or two in here that I really attach to. The lines, finally, it is the same object which provides the subject matter or the quality of parental Oedipal images. One could therefore say that the series under consideration converged towards the good object of the heights, But this is not the case. The good object functions only insofar as it is lost and withdrawn into this height, which constitutes its proper dimension, and acts only as the source of disjunction, the source of omission or liberation of alternatives, that it has carried off in its retirement the secret of an immanent superior unity. That's like poetry, or the way representations play a role inside of his upcoming work in Anti-Oedipus. Like it's a really fantastic set of lines. Really like this one. All right, let's take it from the top. The third figure. We have the third series now under consideration. These are indeed heterogeneous, but they do not respond to the conditions of continuity and convergence, which ensured their conjunction, again, the previous series. Is a nature into them about heterogeneity and homogeneity that allows them to converge, have continuity between each other. It's a thing that replaces, as he said previously, replaces actually homogeneity. But because of this third figure, they diverge and resonate only on one condition, on this condition. On the other, they constitute ramified disjunctions, give rise to this disjunctive synthesis. The disjunctive synthesis here, not being greatly dissimilar to AO, but I'm at a loss of words of how to explain it. If anyone wants to dive in.
Yeah, I've got a suspicion that this paragraph just says it says one thing which it then contradicts, but I might be wrong. But it's such a long paragraph, and I think the reasoning is very extended, which makes it difficult to get a handle on it.
I think so. Where we're starting is at the end of the previous element. So if we talk about, we're talking here about the three syntheses from Anti-Oedipus. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. It's a very junior version of them, but these are the three series. This is the series that goes in order. What's happened is we've gone through the first one, which is all the pieces, partial objects connecting, getting together. We have the sort of second part where we've placed them in their series. We've put them together and we've found in them a sort of a resonance between them, a way that we can describe them. And the third part, this third figure of this serial form, the way he's describing it here as I'm reading it is now we have, at this point, this idol, as he describes it, but this, so far we've been having sort of heterogeneous series that yield homogeneous, back to heterogeneous at this point. But now we have a really unique thing because we have this next level that's happening. They no longer respond to the conditions of continuity and convergence, which prior to this had ensured the conjunction. On the one hand, they diverge and resonate only on this condition. On the other, they constitute ramified disjunctions, and they give rise to a disjunctive synthesis. This pushing together, the synthesis. Why am I unable to describe this? I have it in my brain and I can't find the words. It doesn't matter. This serial form puts images into play, but whatever the heterogeneity of the images might be, which at this point there's a lot of heterogeneity, because not only do we have the pre-genital images of partial zones, which are completely disconnected, not really having their own meaning, or we have the images that Oedipus has given us on the other side of things of our parents. Ultimately, the common origin is this idol, the good object lost, which is commonly considered like the phallic element. Now it's withdrawn to the heights. This object, this North Star that we're aiming at, that we see as, oh, if we get there, only there are we able to find this perfect unity. But there's nothing there. It's bullshit. It's never going to get there. It's already gone. And as such, we have this really awful disjunctive synthesis of us trying to shove these things together to fit whatever form we believe needs to be fit in order to make that happen. That's how I read kind of this section as we go.
So is this disjunctive synthesis, the third of the series? Is that the castration that pushes the went into the symbolic order of the heights. The good object, it represents the superego, the idol that he can never, achieve or satisfy because there is a lack there, that kind of
I, I,
disjunction.
I don't think we're
Rep-
necessarily at superego yet. I think we're still in this
Yeah.
specifically within these 3 series,
Right.
within the series. Like, I think we're still in that point. We haven't gotten to the point where there is, like, we haven't generated an ego. We have Phantasm, but we
Right.
haven't generated ego, id, superego, none of those things. We're not quite there yet. We're still in that, how a series itself sort of has series within it, the series of the series. It's series all the way down, I guess I'm saying.
Yeah, right. But I mean, how do you interpret what he means by the good object, the idol? Wouldn't that be one of the parents, the father figure, perhaps? That is that is in the heights. That
I have a thought here, but I'd love to hear Derek's and Jack's.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it is the father figure. I think the good object in the height is always the father withdrawn. In the Oedipal complex, the child is always trying to bring back, to restore. I think, yeah, as Brooks is saying, I think this is really about this serial form. So he's trying to give us an idea of this. He talks about this as the third figure of the serial form. And he starts by saying series under consideration are heterogeneous. So we have two, prior to this, we have 2 forms of the series. One is homogeneous, one is heterogeneous. So this third figure, they are heterogeneous, but they don't have the conditions of continuity and convergence to ensure their conjunction. So from that, one can read that this is the conditions of the previously understood heterogeneous in terms of continuity convergence. So this new serial form that diverge and resonate. So this is what you've just spoken about in the previous paragraph about the notion that there's a pre-genital and there's pubescent. So they diverge, but they come together and they resonate. And this notion of resonance is to do with just like ramified disjunction. They give rise to a disjunctive synthesis. So this is how they. This is in this third serial form. There is this notion of disjunctive synthesis. He's already spoken about before, I would say, but he's bringing this in again.
Well, and I found my words for it. It's specifically in this case, the way he's utilizing it is their relation is only through non-relation. It's a specific thing because it's ramifying the disjunction, giving rise to a disjunctive synthesis, which means these 2 things are different. It's an affirmation of difference in this moment as I'm reading it.
That's the whole point of the lollipop when you're speaking publicly, isn't it? To disjunct you from all of the things that are distracting you, all the things that you might be feeling.
This is much deeper than that. We're talking about literally the meaning of why we say a lollipop is not gum, or why I am man, not woman. The phrasing of these series diverge and resonate only now on this condition of this last bit, because they no longer respond to conditions of continuity and convergence, which ensured the conjunction in the first place. Now they constitute ramified disjunctions, giving rise to a disjunctive synthesis. And a disjunctive synthesis is, at its core, the relation of non-relation. Am I right on that, Derek, Jack? Because it's a specific phrasing around this that I find really interesting, as we talk about basically defining things as being different, which seems to be the case here, especially as we appeal to the Oedipal images and the parental images that have been set out, again, playing with this.
I think, yeah, because I think he's talking about disjunctive synthesis. So 2 things that are 2 opposites almost, 2 very different things that come together in a synthesis, and how they combine. But it's not a combination, as he says earlier on. It's not one of convergence or continuity and convergence. It's a different way. And he talks about this as reinforcement. We saw at the 2 extremities of serial form. He goes on, the serial forms puts images into play whatever the heterogeneous. So these images might be very, very heterogeneous images. So you talk about the pre-genital images of the partial zones, which you talked to, which is where the piece of candy or the chewing gum came in. Or parental images of Oedipus. These are very different images.
Right.
So they're heterogeneous to each other. They have a common origin, which is the idol. This is where the idol come in. Idol, or as we also calls it, the good object, which, as you say, which is the father, essentially the father lost and withdrawn in the height.
Right, right.
So
So
it says, go on.
yeah, that's the complexity of Oedipus, right? He identifies with the father image. At the same time, he's also has these other negative feelings, right? That dissociates.
No, but I wouldn't make it so literal, actually, because I think basically he's saying the good object coordinates the pre-genital image,
Mhm.
which is prior to the Oedipal,
Yeah,
and
right.
the Oedipal images. So it's not, the center of this is not Oedipus. It's a good object withdrawn in the heights, I would say from that. So because what he's trying to get at is this disjunctive synthesis, these two very different things, which is the pre-genital images and the pubescent images, where the pubescent is probably where the Oedipal complex resides, I would say. But we have a pre-genital before any of that takes place.
Right,
These two things resonate with each other.
right.
So they both have their origin in the idol, and they've got to get lost and withdrawn in the height. So he says it is this object, first of all, renders possible a conversion of depth into partial surfaces,
Right, right.
release of these surfaces and the images haunting them. And he said, but this good object has two functions. So it renders possible conversion of depth. Also, the same object, in the guise of good penis projects the phallus and image over the genital zone. So that's what gives rise to the kind of Oedipal moment through the kind of, it's coordinated by the kind of phallic, the phallus as an image of the genital zone. He says, fine, it's the same object, subject matter of the quality of parental Oedipal images. So it has this very kind of multifaceted function. So I think it's probably a mistake to just focus in on just the Oedipal, because it goes beyond that. The Oedipal is one aspect of that.
Right, right. Yeah. So, but he ends that paragraph by saying it's the evolution of Oedipus that I think the all the three syntheses are is concerned with, right?
He goes on to say the series under consideration. So this is the third year of the series. So one could say, one could therefore say that the series under consideration converge towards the good object of the height. So we could say that this is what they all go towards. But then he contradicts that. He says, no, this is not at all the case. He says the good object, the idol, functions only insofar as it is lost, withdrawn into its height, which constitutes proper dimension. It only functions as long as it's in that, it functions in that dimension. That's its proper dimension to be withdrawn. As we know, I mean, I'm just perhaps getting a bit ahead, but I would say, as we know, the Oedipal, what he wants to do is bring that back from the heights. But let's just see what he says. And this capacity always acts only as a source of disjunctions, a source of emissions or liberation alternatives, carried off in its withdrawal, the secret of an eminent superior unity. So in a sense, the source of these disjunctions, he said, is this good object withdrawn in the height. He says, then he says the good object was defined in this manner: wounded, unharmed, present, absent. So it's defined in terms of disjunctions. These two-word phrases, each of them is a disjunction. So wounded and harmed, so they're opposites. It's a synthesis. That is a disjunctive synthesis: wounded and harmed, and present, absent. So this is how their kind of good objects is actually defined. Ever since, anyway, just carry on. This is what I mean about this. It's very kind of long in the sense it's it's very long in its narrative to get to the actual point.
Well, because the next sentence is what carries that. When it determines parental images, it is again by dissociating its own aspects. by distributing them in alternatives, which supply the alternating terms of the Oedipal series, by arranging them around the image of the mother, wounded to be healed, and the image of the father. It's the movement of this and the movement of all of this is, again, ramifying the differences between any of these singular elements, creating that disjunctive synthesis, as he's describing it, that gives us the differences between the two images, the singular elements. Everything has to be as such. It's arranged de facto, sort of before it even gets to us as subjects. They're arranged around those two series very cleanly. That's, I think, a really, to me, that's an important sort of addition to that, because, again, when we start focusing on the good object or the parental images that are made with it, that's core to that. The entire idea here that everything then gets sort of pre-made into where it needs to be and fits within those series. But with mommy, daddy being two separate ones, the disjunctive.
And he says that, so as we were saying earlier, the good object was defined as in terms of disjunctive synthesis, so wounded, unharmed, present, absence. But he said in the same vein, it posed an alternative on the ego to model itself after the good object, or to identify itself with bad objects. So it has this same disjunctive structure in relation to the ego.
That sounds like the double-bind paralogism from AO as well. The double-bind paralogism from AO is the way that someone says to you, oh, you'll be healthy, you'll identify with mommy or daddy, and you will properly be triangulated, or you will be lost to the abyss. It sounds like that's just a different phrasing of that same exact sentence. Because
I think essentially he's talking about the second part of this paragraph is of how the good object functions. So then he goes on to say, when the good object renders possible spreading out a partial zone, so this is the kind of pre-genital in relation to the partial zones, the erogenous zones, establishes only as disjointed and separate. So they are separate, they're disjointed from each other, not the same, like opposites. And he says to the point that they will find their convergence only with the phallus. So again, it's this thing from the outside that comes and brings them together. And then second, when it determines parental images, it's again by dissociating its own aspect, by distributing them in alternatives, supply the alternated terms of the Oedipal series, which you've already kind of looked at, I think, really, he's already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So by range, right, the image of the mother wounded and to be healed, and the image of the father withdrawn to mate. Those are the alternated terms, the kind of disjunctive syntheses relate to the mother and the father. So because of that, only the phallus would then be left as an agent of conversion and coordination. Problem. So this is the structure. I think he's given this structure. The good object coordinates in terms of disjunctive synthesis, like the pre-genital zones for etc. But they're all coordinated in terms of these, like the mother in terms of they're like in the Oedipal series, the wounded and to be healed, these disjunctives, these opposite terms. So only the phallus would then be left as agent. So it's only the phallus, a thing from outside that kind of traces a line at the surface. Agent of conversion coordination is that it itself gets involved in Oedipal dissociations. So this is, I think, this is what I'm saying. I think this whole paragraph is coming towards this problem. So it would seem that only the phallus is then left. So the Oedipal kind of drags everything apart together and take it apart, because only the phallus would then be left as it seems to be left as the agent of convergence and coordination, which is the characteristic of what creates a heterogeneous series.
But
the problem,
but the problem is it itself gets involved in the Oedipal dissociations. We can clearly see above all that it evades its role if we refer to the other end of the chain, no longer to the origin of images, but rather to their common dissipation during the evolution of Oedipus. And that's the next paragraph, which I'm going to dive into, and I think we will end after this, because I think we're going to hit the 2-hour mark, and we're about halfway, and we're not going to finish it in another half hour. Just letting everyone know. This will be the paragraph. And we'll discuss everything up to this point, because this is a good break point anyway. So again, going back, no longer the origin of images, but rather the common dissipation. This is because in its evolution and in line with it, which it traces, the phallus marks always an excess and a lack, oscillating between one and the other and even being both at once. It is essentially an excess, as it projects itself over the genital zone of the child, duplicating its penis and inspiring it with the Oedipal affair. But it is essentially lack and deficiency when it designates at the heart of the affair the absence of the penis in the case of the mother. It is in relation to itself that the phallus is both a defect and an excess. When the phallic line merges with the trace of castration, and the excessive image no longer designates anything other than its own lack as it takes away the child's penis. We are not going to repeat the characteristics of the phallus that Lacan has analyzed in several well-known texts. It is the paradoxical element, or object equals X, missing always its own equilibrium, at once excess and deficiency, never equal, missing its own resemblance, its own identity, its own origin, its own place, and always displaced in relation to itself. It is floating signifier and floated signified, place without occupant and occupant without place, the empty square, which can also create an excess through this void, and a supernumerary object, which can also create a lack by being this excess number. It is the phallus which brings about the resonance of the two series that we earlier called Pre-Genital and Oedipal, and which can also receive different qualifications, provided that, through all possible qualifications, the one is determined as signified and the other as signifying. It's the phallus, which is surface nonsense, twice nonsense, as we have seen, and which distributes sense to the two series, as something happening to the one and something insisting in the other. It is thus inevitable that the first series does not yet imply a comprehension of what is in question. The third footnote, it's worth reading because it's a little bit of a discussion on Lacan. These series may be quite variable, but they are always discontinuous. Above all, and he's talking about the pre-genital and the other series. Crap, my brain. Pre-Oedipal. Pre-genital series puts into play not only partial erogenous zones and their images, it also sets in motion pre-Oedipal parental images, fabricated in an entirely different manner than they will be later on, and fragmented according to the zones. This series, therefore, necessarily implicates adults in relation to the child, without the child's being able to comprehend what is in question, parental series. In the second series, on the other hand, it is the child or young man who conducts himself as an adult. For example, in Lacan's analysis of the rat man, there is the series of the father who affected the child very early on, and belongs to the familial legend. Debt friend rich, woman poor woman. And there is also another series with the same terms, disguised and shifted, that the subject later on recovers for his own account, the debt playing the role of the object equals X, bringing about the resonance of the two series. See Jacques Lacan, the myth of the neurotic individual, I believe is how it's translated, but individual névrose. Or another example, Proust's Remembrance. The hero undergoes a series of amorous experiences of the pre-genital sort with his mother. He then undergoes another series with Albertine. But the pre-genital series has already put into play, in a mysterious, non-comprehensive or pre-comprehensive mode, the adult model of Swann's love for Odette, the common theme of the captive, indicating the object equals X. It's actually a really nice explanation of this entire paragraph. I leave it open, please.
should we just look for this reason he gives? So he says from the previous paragraph that phallus evades its role. So along with the origin of images, brought their common dissipation during the evolution of Oedipus. I mean, this notion of dissipation of images again was something in the previous series. Which to be honest with you, I don't have a really clear handle on personally. I don't know if anyone else has this notion of images, dissipation of images, how they're dissipated. Perhaps this paragraph might tell us. This is because in its evolution, the line which it traces phallus marks always an excess and a lack. This sort of disjunctive, this excess and the lack. So he says it's the excess as it projects itself over the genital zone of the child. So in this genital stage, then it's inspiring it with the Oedipal affair. And it's a lack, yeah. So he says it designates at the heart of the affair, the Oedipal affair, the absence of the penis in the case of the mother. This again is something he refers to earlier when the child wants to restore the mother wants to restore the mother. One of the things comes out that the mother lacks a penis. So relates to itself, but again, these kind of use these disjunctive terms as a defect. Well, I don't know if it is a disjunctive defect and an excess.
Well, it's the line between the two series that the phallus takes, because it is the phallus that brings about the resonance of the two series we earlier called Pre-Genital and Oedipal. The resonance being the thing that produces the phantasm, which is where the ego sits, which is an interesting phrasing because as he talks through this, he then says, it is the phallus which is surface nonsense, twice nonsense, which distributes sense through the two series, one as something happening and the other as something insisting. This idea of this is who I am, this is what is happening in one series, but here is my drive and what I really want under the other, the one insisting on the other. The first series does not yet imply a comprehension of what is in question, which is really interesting as well to add. So we have the pre-genital, which is, in Freud's world, kind of everything, but it's not fully meaning anything unto itself. It is only through the second series, the resonance between them, and then ultimately the phallus, which distributes meaning between both of them, that we're able to actually come out of and say, oh, here is why blah, 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 and here's why I am this way, and create sort of that self-justifying backstory of series that generate us.
So does the excess come from the first two series, and then the lack, is from the third series with the castration? Would that be correct understanding how that excess and lack, originates?
The phallus itself is a fascinating one. So I have an answer, maybe. So in the 29th series, we went over Oedipus as a thing, how good deeds are inevitably punished. The phallus is an image that is created. This sort of phallic projection that gets added as an image, as a setup. Again, not a thing. The phallus isn't a thing itself. It exists sort of almost purely as an image, to be frank. This sort of setup, as it's here, means that the element of how Oedipus ultimately plays towards that good object, I'm reading the good object as being the phallus.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to everyone? Because he hasn't explicitly said it, but it does seem to be the case.
Yeah. So to me, it kind of makes sense that it would there would be this explains why this feeling of excess, right, in terms of phallus,
Yes.
and then the lack, right, the that derives from this moment of castration.
So then where does this disjunctive synthesis between the two objects come from if they're
Now
both
recording.
synonymous?
Sorry about that, guys. I had to re-get the bot in here.
If they're to be synonymous, or if they're to be synonymous, then where's this disjunctive synthesis in the third series? I think that the object is clearly a fuck your phallus kind of thing. I mean, it's not a phallus in any way, and it is completely um disjunctive too. You should have some cognitive dissonance about trying to make them one and the same. I think
I think
trying to make
I think we're talking about the idols, and I think that the idea of the idols that exist on high, to go back to the topology of all of it, the representations of things. We're talking about idols. The phallus being an image that's projected onto an idol, perhaps, that then utilizes its position to distribute, as nonsense itself, is able to distribute sense across both series and create that sort of de facto quasi-causal meaning to things that seems like it came before, is how it feels like it's playing out to me during this. It's the last line. Sorry, go ahead, Derek. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that, the phallus, I think in this paragraph is very clear about the phallus because it has this relationship to the series and it's this kind of object equal X. Also, I would say things like in the past he's talked about esoteric words, portmanteau words, which have the role is to kind of make the series resonate, to kind of interact with each other. But about the notion of the disjunction, so he says they're both excess and lack. So that is a disjunction. The excess in that the phallus image projected onto the child creates a further penis. So it says duplicates its penis, which in turn inspires it with the Oedipal affair. It's also lack when it is at the heart of the affair, of the Oedipal affair, the absence of the penis. This is the kind of core of the Oedipal complex. So I think that's where the disjunction kind of in part happens. He says he goes on to say it is the phallus is the paradoxical element or object equal X, missing all with its own equilibrium. Again, once excess and deficiency, again, is this disjunctive structure of the phallus in the way in which it kind of all relates to and makes the series resonate. Never equal, missing its own resemblance, its own identity, its own origin, its own place, and always displaced in relation to itself. Again, this is a kind of repetition of what's gone earlier. It's a floating, I don't mean early today, but I mean early in previous series. It's floating signifier and floated signified. That occupant and occupant without place, the empty square, supernumerary object. So it is the phallus which, again, the key here, I think, is the phallus which brings back the resonance of the two series that we earlier called pre-genital Oedipal. You can also receive different qualifications, provided that through all possible qualifications, the one determined as signified, the other as signifying. Because it's this structure, it's given this structure, it's a kind of complex structure. Is looking at how the two series that we've had of the pre-genital and Oedipal, the two kind of temporally disjointed series, are kind of what makes them resonate. And he said it's the phallus, and the phallus is what's it characterized? It's characterized in its own by itself in terms of how it operates, in terms of disjunction. It's a lack, an excess, etc., etc. So just go back again, phallus that brings. So the key is that towards the end of the paragraph, it says the phallus brings back the resonance of two series, which we earlier called pre-genital Oedipal, which provide different qualifications, provided that through all possible one term is signified, the other signifying. So the phallus is surface nonsense, twice nonsense we've seen, which distributes sense to the two series. So he said, so what this is the role of the floating signifier, object equal x, is its role is to distribute sense to those two series. And as I said earlier, we had much of the esoteric word, portmanteau word. Anyway, but so distribute sense. So in one series, it's something happening to the one. This is the signified, I would say, the signified of the two. There's something insisting in the other. So insisting this, in this sense, means it's a kind of similar thing to existing, but it's something that is within this other series. So he says, anyway, that's my take on that.
No, I think we're actually getting back to, he's coming back to what he originally talked about when he brought up nonsense in the first place. The nature of nonsense themselves is that they are both word and thing, as a paradoxical element. This name is itself nonsense. The phallus is that as well. It is both word and thing. He later goes on to basically describe this as being something that exists in the heights. I would go on to then say he talks about it being representation, but it's not just that nonsense has some sort of element itself, but it is naturally sort of co-present and produces sense. It doesn't have sense itself. It doesn't have the ability to copy the way things work, but instead it imparts, as it exists, sense onto other elements. That's the sort of nature of nonsense. Again, which is, nonsense is not absurdity, but its own sort of take on the entire thing. So if
that resonates quite strongly, with my understanding of it. I mean, because I don't think that the object is really anything to fixate on in the first place, but it is certainly something that the disjunction of is functional. It works for the presence of other things, I mean, and so I don't like cling to it for anything as an object, but I do cling to it as something that is dissonant to other insistence of a phallus. I mean, it's kind of like this carnal ugliness to try to insist that whenever it could just be something that is just there. I mean, and I think that it could come out and like it could rear its ugly head in many different faculties.
But a specific function in that, though, then that's, I think, a great way to go to this. The function of nonsense and how it plays within a series is really interesting, because the way he described nonsense operating is it gives a donation of sense. The way he talked about it, it sort of leaves some behind. But specifically, a heterogeneous series gets, via the regressive law, gets sense distributed across it from the place of nonsense. We're now talking about that happening from the place of the phallus through this massively heterogeneous series, which is the pre-genital stage, which is just fragmented bodies and everything, this deeply heterogeneous series. But the phallus comes in and through the regressive law distributes names across all of that in a heterogeneous series of events through signified and signifying, is what he's describing here exactly. It's actually...
The phallus would be a natural center, yes.
It comes right back to it. It's really interesting. It comes right back to that original sort of understanding of nonsense and how he brought forward that. Because he's talking about, literally, it's the same thing here, but it's the phallus now doing this retroactive sort of regressive naming exercise, where the pre-genital, as he described before, is fragmented. There's no words there. A child at 1.5 seeing his parents have sex doesn't know sex or even really anything going on. He's not able to piece any of it. But then how come later he's able to, and he's able to assign these words to it? Well, that's the argument I think he's making here is we have the series of things that happened that was pre-genital, which is a very deep formation of fragmented elements that sort of make us up. We have another series, which is the stuff that sort of happened after that we give a little bit more meaning to, or we have that. And then between them, we have effectively the phantasm of our ego that's produced. And in this, we have the good penis. I think he even phrases it as such, or the phallic object, the idol that we're aiming at, thanks to Oedipus, dickhead, leaving that behind. And we have this thing we're aiming at. But what that phallus does is, by being named as such and by being placed where it is, it creates and ramifies the names of all of those things in that pre-genital stage according to the series that it's opposing. And so as such, actually retroactively in this event, my pre-genital understanding of everything gets reset according to my experience, and what's being told of me is the good penis. And as such, the ego and phantasm gets generated out of this process. Maybe that was a bit much, but
I don't think it's I don't think it's just like just happens. I think it's like something that's very intentional.
oh no, it's
Like,
continuous. It's something that's continuous, I would say. Like, again, this is a very specifically outlining his process of becoming, but he's doing it in a way cleverly that is bringing in the sort of notions of the pre-Oedipal, the pre-genital. How do we discover meaning? How do those things exist and line up? And how do we then create meaning around it? Well, we've done that by retroactively adding, via the phallus, this ramification of names that has placed them in a very specific order. It's a really interesting... I like this. This is interesting. Phrasing of that. Because it also means that as I continue to do things or have my one series, which he says there's something happening to one and something insisting in the other, the nature of the phallus, the insisting is something that is sort of constantly evolving as is happening. These series are always shifting and always growing. And so one is always regenerating the other based on dozens of different things. My understanding and shape of whatever I think that good penis or that phallus is, therefore ramifies and changes names, but I don't even notice it happening. It's a thing that just is popping up, and the things I'm remembering or what I'm remembering and how I'm calling them and what ethical considerations I'm giving them is always constantly shifting and changing. It's through this process, and therefore also the phantasm and also the ego in turn are shifting and changing constantly as well. Really interesting phrasing of that. Please, Derek, Jack, anyone else, please thoughts on this before I start closing us out, because we just hit the 2 hours and we are not far enough to say we're going to get through this.
I just agree with what you say. I agree with what you're saying, and it's what I find interesting where he brings in the structure of this serial structure that is previously laid out in a quite detailed manner. It re-emerges here. I think I like that. I like that. Yeah.
Jack,
So
if you're still there, Jack, I would argue that this at this point is now a better explanation of the emergent subject in Anti-Oedipus than Anti-Oedipus does for it. Like this is a far better explanation of the exact same thing, slightly different wording, but it's this.
So does the phallus, in Oedipus become the socius, or is it,
I think his use of phallus here very specifically is in relation to the Oedipalization that we go through. I don't think he's saying that it's necessarily determinate in the same way that a socius would be.
Right.
The way that a phallus shows up here is through the Oedipalization of the child. We have the good penis, the proper way to be, the good person, the good object that is on high, that we have that representation through the good, again, the good intentions of Oedipus, which he very clearly lays out as this is intended to be for the best, but it's not necessarily determinate of Oedipus. Instead, the phallus in this case is that, but it can be any sort of representation or good object.
Right. At the same, it seems like its destiny is to be the master signifier or eventually be the superego, right? And it could very easily become, identified with the despotic or the socius, right?
I think, yeah, well, once we have the image in place and once this is going, the entire process of how our Oedipalization forms, that is then, I think, the big project of Capitalism, Schizophrenia, Anti-Oedipus, to say why in capital we have this, but under despotism, not quite the same way. I think he would argue and say that the nature of the two series, which I think he would go on to say different elements sort of form up and are the two series that are being sort of ramified. The elements that are pushing up against them don't have the same push as they do in capital. We don't have the same Oedipalization because not everything is done in a single series of daddy, mommy, me as it is under the despot, where in the despot, everything is despot, despot, me. For example, daddy, mommy, me is sort of through that. There is no such thing as daddy, mommy, me inside of the primitive. So here, very specifically, he's talking about this contingent element of where Oedipalization and the phallus comes to be within this specific way that Oedipus works on sort of our ontogenesis, our understanding of everything.
Yeah. Right.
This is a great paragraph. Sorry, I'm actually kind of stunned by this. Derek, Jack, please give some final thoughts, and I'm going to go ahead and kick us out so I don't keep rambling, because I fucking will.
Well, I'm just looking ahead to the next paragraph. So the question is, how does the phallus of the object equal X cause the series to resonate? So we still it hasn't come to an end. It still will continue next week.
Oh, for sure. It's going to be next week, same phallus time, same good penis channel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, you, everyone.